Want to thank Amy and Brian for being our energy to always connect Hartman to us every month. Both the technology and the energy for the idea and scheduling. It wouldn't happen without Amy and Brian, and we're very grateful. And most of all, I want to thank my friend and colleague, Elana Stein Hain. She's just the best teacher. Every time I listen to an Elana Stein Hain lecture, I walk away with questions, and I've never heard her without emailing her afterwards. Hey, but what about this? But what about that? But what about this? But what about that? The best kind of a teacher leaves you with questions, not answers, and that is Elana. So, Elana, thank you for bringing your incredible Torah to us this morning.
Things. It's so easy to do so because here I am in front of a screen and here you are in front of a screen. And maybe sometime in the next few years, we will all be in the same room and that would just be fabulous. But in the meantime, Amy and Brian, thank you. Rabbi Garden Schwartz, thank you. And my colleague Talia Graff, who's on the call, thank you. And all of you, it's 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday and you're here to learn Torah. I'm so excited. What a joy. So let's talk about the topic. Over the last, pandemic, over the last year, but it's more than that. It's the last 4 years, the last 8 years, it's the last 12 years. It's as this insane polarization and divisiveness has been building in our country as a whole. And as you just see in this past year, so much of it erupting, not just in political ways, but in just the way people talk to each other, the way people interact with each other, the tolerance and intolerance that we have for each other. I've just been thinking a lot about this question of how do you build a sense of mutual responsibility in a society? We are a country and thus a Jewish community that is tinged so much by the rights discourse, as in what rights do I have, that sometimes it is hard to talk about obligation discourse. What am I obligated to do? To whom am I obligated? We're such an individualistic society that sometimes it's hard to talk about collectivity when that collectivity that you're talking about is not just clones of yourself and the people that you choose. And so I've really been thinking about this. The pandemic examples are easy. It's the people who are making choices where you say to yourself, are you really doing that? How are you doing that? Don't you realize how it's going to impact the rest of us? Right? And the political choices, they're all over the place. We're shocked by the choices that people make. And what I realized is that the nub of the issue for me, and I hope that you'll relate to this, is that in order to talk about mutuality in a society, we need to take people's ability to make choices seriously. We need to take seriously the notion that people will make their choices and sometimes we will be scandalized by their choices. And when we are scandalized by those choices, what is our response as a community and as a society? And of course, there's questions of what are the responses in the moment? How do you deal with it in the moment, right? So for example, I'm very happy that now people have to wear masks in airports. That makes me very happy that that's now a rule, right? That's a response, an enforceable rule. That's a response to the fact that people were making choices that were endangering other people, right? There's also a long-term question, not just how do we deal with this right now, but how do we deal with this going forward? How do we create a society where that muscle and that reflex, if not for everyone, because that's rather impossible, for the majority, that muscle and reflex is natural to care about other people. And I think there are two ways to go about it, two essential pathways to it. One really is the legal pathway. We know that the beauty of law and rules that are enforceable is that nobody has to love the law, nobody has to love the rule, but we have to have ways of coming to agreed upon legal enforceable rules. And sometimes in pandemic, in use of litigation to promote false allegations of voter fraud, in cases of anti-Semitism on both sides of the aisle, we realize that maybe we need better laws. Maybe we need better rules. Maybe there are too many loopholes here that you can drive a truck through, and maybe we need to change that and fix that. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. And if we were having a conversation today about how the rabbinic tradition views responding to crisis through new rules and enforceable rules, we could have that shiur. We could have that class, and there would be plenty to talk about. For instance, I might talk to you about the concept of midat Sodom, the measure of Sodom, the measure of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the rabbis say, you know what? We know that there's such a thing as private property, but if you're refusing to give up something of yours when it costs you nothing, where it really could help somebody else, we're going to tell you, we understand by law it's private property, it's yours, you can keep it. We're going to tell you, we don't like this. We are not going to create a situation where we are Sodom-like. And we're going to actually change the law. And in a situation where we see that somebody's withholding from someone else just because they can, and not because it's going to cost them anything, we are going to call that out as a legal infraction. There's plenty to talk about on this score. And in some ways, talking about law is easier because you don't have to like each other. You don't have to agree on much. You just need what we call rules of recognition. You need the way that the law gets passed. You have enough votes, you pass it, that's it. Maybe enforceable means causes people to have this sort of reflexive way of being, even if they're not thinking too much about it, but now the standards are higher. But there's a completely different way, and I would say complementary way, to deal with the problem of rampant lack of mutual regard in our society. And that is, it is emphatically not through legal means. Because part of taking people's ability to make choices seriously, one route is to say, let's limit their choices. That's the rules enforceability approach. But another way is, wow, we really have to educate people about their choices. We can't actually control the choice that they're going to make. But what we need to do is we need to inspire people. We need to instill within people a sense of why they should be making a choice that reflects caring about someone else and not just themselves. And as obvious as we thought that was, it's clearly not so obvious. And I think more than ever, I am realizing the role of rabbis and educators in these kinds of moments, because sometimes we feel like we're talking to the wall. We say the same things over and over again. And we say, why do I have to say the same things over and over again? Wes, I don't know if you ever feel this way when you're writing a sermon, where you say to yourself, I think we talked about this. Why are we talking about this again? And what I'm realizing more and more is that actually people need to talk about it, because there is a maintenance of the kind of norms. There's a reinvestment in the kinds of norms that we should be caring about, that if we stop verbally and explicitly reinvesting in them and talking about why they matter and talking about where they come from, we actually lose them. And that's part of the ugly rhetoric of the last 4 years. We actually lose them. It's real erosion. And so I want to spend some time looking at two concepts in rabbinic literature today that take the ability for human beings to make choices, bad choices, bad choices and good choices. Take it seriously. They take human discretion seriously. And in each one of these, I don't want to just present it as a salve. And in fact, I owe Wes big time on this one, because I did present one of them as a salve a few months ago. And Wes wrote to me, how could you? Right? In a great way. And I want to look at the problematics of each one of these concepts. Because if we really do want to be able to educate ourselves and others about how to create this kind of, if not bonded society, mutually aware society, we need to also deal with the difficulties that are going to arise and do arise by definition. Okay? So we're going to look at these two concepts today. One thing I want to say, just to frame for a second, which is one of the things I love so much about rabbinic literature is that the rabbis think that human beings are incredible. On the question of, the perennial question in philosophy of, are human beings actually by nature violent and brutish, and we need ways to prop ourselves up, or are human beings by nature sublime in a way, and do they have incredible potential that they can activate on their own? I think it's mixed within rabbinic ideating on the subject, but there are places where the rabbis are so optimistic about what human beings can do. And one of those places is where the rabbis over and over and over again throughout their literature talk about how jealous angels are of human beings. Now, forget the metaphysics of it, right? What's an angel? What do they mean? What they think an angel is some metaphysical being that's very close to God that does whatever God says, essentially. And yet, over and over again, they talk about how angels are jealous of people. You know the story of the angel, hurting Jacob's hip because the angel was jealous. The story of Jacob it's in Tractate Chulin. Happy to send it to whoever wants to see it. The angels going up and down the ladder in Jacob's dream. They're going up, they're seeing God's throne of glory and saying, hey, how come there's a face of a human being on there? And they're going down and they're looking at Jacob's. What does that guy have over us? Why is his face? And over again, what seems to come through is that the rabbis think that human beings are superior to angels because we have choice, because we have free will. It is essential to our humanity. And to take that seriously, both in terms of how you want to curtail that freedom of choice, but also how you want to educate and shape that freedom of choice, to me is a very tall order. And we are in a very deep rut on this issue, but I don't think that warrants just giving in to what this rut is. Now, we have 105 people on this call, which is, wow, that's so exciting. I don't want you to just sit there silently and listen to me. I also want to hear from you. So what I'd like to do is, as we learn about each of these concepts, these two concepts that we're going to look at, rabbinic concepts to voluntary conscience, essentially, I'm going to open it up after each one, which means if you want to write in the chat, if you want to raise your hand, you want to speak by voice, whatever makes you happy, we're going to make time for that. So the first thing I want to do, and I hope that you'll participate with me, and I know not all 105 people will, is given the framing that I just gave of taking choice seriously, the ways that people disappoint each other in the way they make choices. Is law the right move? Is education the right move? I am curious, just by I guess we're going to do a raise of hands. Who here says law is the right way to do it? You gotta, and I know we need both, but I want to know where I want to know where your natural inclination is. Who here, when they see all the craziness that's been going on, violence, anti-masking, all of this garbage that we've seen, who here says it's law? We got to change the law. We got to fix the law. Give us a raise of hands. Okay. Great. Oh, and I love that people on the phone are raising their cartoon hands. Okay, so we got some people. Who here says we need to focus on education? Ooh la la! This very pro-education crowd, perhaps not surprisingly, right? So I just want you to hold on to the fact that you're both right. Okay, meaning that's how I want to start. Is I want us to recognize none of this is mutually exclusive. It's work that we may need to do in both arenas. Okay, let's start with our first concept. Now, if anybody watched our Hartman Civic Symposium, which was months ago, I don't even remember when it was, I actually presented this concept, and I want to present it very differently today than I did then. And it goes like this. The concept is called, I would say it's the keep the change concept. The first concept I want to look at is the keep the change concept. It's where you give a little extra. You being a good gal, good guy, good person, you give a little extra, right? I give, Martin gives me $10. The thing costs $8. I'm going to give him $2 back. He said, nah, keep the change, no problem. Now, why does Martin do that? Could be a lot of reasons why Martin does that. Could be that he knows that I'm having a little financial trouble during the pandemic. So he's like, you know what, every bit counts, let me give it to her. Could be he knows that sometimes I give him a little extra. His grandkids come into the shop, I give them some sweets. He wants to maintain that sense of reciprocity. Could be there's somebody there that he wants to impress. He wants to look like a good guy. Could be, by the way, that he really has nowhere to put the change. So he's just like, yeah, just take the 10, just right. A lot of reasons why people don't take everything that's coming to them. They can be very selfish reasons, and they can be very selfless reasons. But the idea here is that the focus is on not a rule. Martin's not following a rule by letting me keep the change. The focus is on discretion. And the rabbis call this lifnim mishurat hadin. Lifnim mishurat hadin, people often explain as going beyond the letter of the law, but actually, literally, lifnim means within, shurat, the line of hadin, the law. It literally means staying within the line of the law. So in other words, the law allows Martin to get $2 back, and he says, you know what? I'm not going to go all the way to the line. I'm going to give up some of that. Right? It's essentially, it's something that is so difficult in a rights discourse to talk about without getting nervous, where you're sort of like, you know what, sometimes maybe don't take everything that's coming to you. Sometimes don't take everything that's coming to you. That concept of lifnim mishurat hadin, for the rabbis, they actually source it in yesterday's Torah portion, where the conversation is all about Moses appointing extra judges because his father-in-law Jethro suggests it, right? First best father-in-law along the line of many excellent fathers-in-law and mothers-in-law. I am privileged to have that experience myself. And lifnim mishurat hadin for the rabbis really is part of law. It's not something that is so foreign. It's something that they really want to see people doing within their daily experience, even if you can't make people do it. And I want to look at an example of lifnim mishurat hadin, of where someone didn't have to, by rights, by law, they could have said, I can take up to here. I don't have to do what you're asking me to do. And yet I'm going to pull back a little bit. I'm going to give up a little bit on what I could claim. And instead, I'm going to think about you. And I want to look at what could go wrong. Okay? Because what could go wrong actually makes us think about, how do you want to make this go right? Okay? So I'm going to share my screen. There's some really, I always put in more than we're going to read in the class because I want you to have it. Dr. Deborah Barrer wrote the dissertation, which I hope will be the book on lifnim mishurat hadin. It is absolutely brilliant. And she is the one who took it from the way people talk about this is like there's law and then there's ethics, right? So the law tells you to do da-da-da, but ethics tells you to go farther. She said, that's not true at all. The law has ethics. It's rules and discretion. Rules are what you have to do. Discretion is what you decide you want to do. It's just brilliant work. But let's look at our example, okay? Now, this is in the tractate called Bava Metzia. Now, tractate Bava Metzia is mostly about lost objects. Or actually, I shouldn't say that. The beginning of tractate Bava Metzia is mostly about lost objects. And it also talks about what happens if you see someone struggling with a burden on the road. Because that's also, there's Torah law around that, not just helping people with their lost objects, but actually helping people with the objects they have. So Amy's packing her trunk, right? I'm giving us the modern version. Amy's packing her trunk and her stuff is very heavy. And I see her on the street and she says to me, hey, Elana, like Amy would ever need my help. It's probably the opposite. But Amy says to me, hey, Elana, could you help me pack? You see this big thing I'm carrying. I just got this, plasma, whatever inch TV. It's too heavy for me to carry. Can you help me with it? Biblically, I'm supposed to say yes, right? By Torah law, I'm supposed to say yes. You don't see somebody who is having trouble with their burden and say, it's not my problem. It's not my problem. So we're about to see a situation in which somebody needs help with not lost objects, but the objects they have. They need help from someone else. But either they knew it or they didn't know it. But the person they asked actually by law doesn't have to help them because they asked someone who was much older. And we actually do have a concept in Jewish law that if somebody is of a certain age, you can't expect them to go trying to find people's lost objects, and you can't expect them to help somebody pack their trunk. I would never ask my grandmother, may she live and be well, 96 years old. I've never asked her to help me pack the trunk of my car. That would be a terrible thing to ask, right? So by law, she doesn't have to. And that's the story we're about to see. Somebody needs help, ask someone who doesn't have to help them. And the one who doesn't have to help him tries to help, but let's see what happens when he tries to help. Here we go. Everybody sees it, I assume. Somebody will stop me if they don't. Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, who at this point is advanced in years, we should know. He was walking on the road. A certain man encountered him, and that man was carrying a burden of wooden sticks. He set down the wood and was resting. But then apparently it was time for him to go. So the man said to Rabbi Yishmael, lift them for me and place them upon me. Do me a favor, put it on my back, help me out. Okay. Now, should he have asked Rabbi Yishmael if Rabbi Yishmael's old? Good question, right? But he asks him, he says, can you help me out? Since it was not in keeping with the dignity of Rabbi Yishmael, and this is a legal argument, actually, son of Rabbi Yossi, to lift the wood, Rabbi Yishmael said to him, parentheses, I can't lift the wood, but how much is the wood worth, right? Like, I'll pay you. Clearly, you're trying to get this wood somewhere. Maybe I can pay you for the wood, and you can buy wood closer to where you live, and you don't have to schlep it, right? So he says, how much are they worth? The man replied, a half a dinar. So Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, gave him a half a dinar, and he took possession of the wood. He bought the wood off the guy. But then, of course, what does Rabbi Yishmael do? He doesn't need the wood. So he declares the wood ownerless. He puts it down and he says, whoever wants it can take it. So how nice is Rabbi Yishmael being, right? How nice. Martin, your $2 is nothing compared to Rabbi Yishmael, right? What is Rabbi Yishmael doing? He's saying, by rights, by law, I could say, I'm sorry, kid, I can't help you. I don't have a responsibility. But it says this, I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to try to help you out. I'm going to give you money. And then not only that, but the thing I buy off of you, I'm going to let anybody take it if they want it. Look at what happens. Amazing. It's a sucker born every minute. What does the man do? The original man with the sticks who just made a half a dinar and has enough to go home and get the man then reacquired the wood. Meaning, you see wood, it's sitting in the street, it's ownerless, right? He goes, he picks it up and says, okay, it's mine. It's amazing, right? And then again, he requested that Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, lift the wood for him. Let me ask you, there's nobody else there. It's only Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yossi is the only guy there, right? He says, no, can you help me with the... So Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, again gives him a half dinar. He says, no, this guy is now making a profit off of Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi's goodwill. He's making a profit off of him. Sucker born every minute. So again, Rabbi Yishmael takes possession of the wood, and again, he declares the wood ownerless. He then saw that the man wanted to reacquire the sticks of wood again. Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, said to him, no. I declare the sticks of wood ownerless for everyone else, meaning anybody can take this wood, but not you. I did not declare them ownerless with regard to you. So let's pause here. I'm going to stop my share. This is, as Wes, you put it to me, it's the fryer problem. It's the fryer problem. Here, Rabbi Yishmael was trying to be good. He was trying to be kind. He was trying to be caring. He gave of himself. And what did he get in return? He got a smart aleck in return. That's what he got. He got someone who not only didn't appreciate what he did, but saw it as an opportunity to take advantage of him, right? Remarkable. So you look at this example and you say, I think the message here, and we'll get more into it in a minute, I think the message here is maybe Lifnei Mishrat Adin is not such a great idea. Maybe, right? Like that's, maybe it's not such a great idea, or be careful who you do it with, or be careful who you do it for, right? But wait, the Gemara ends on a very different note, because a few lines later, after explaining that what Rabbi Yishmael was trying to do was lifnim mishurat hadin, right? This is this page. It explains that this is lifnim mishurat hadin that he's trying to do. This is how the Talmudic section ends. Rabbi Yochanan says, Jerusalem was destroyed only for the fact that they adjudicated cases on the basis of Torah law. Al shedanu ba din Torah. Jerusalem was destroyed because they actually used the rules. The Gemara says, what do you mean? What else do you want them to do? You want them to adjudicate decisions on the basis of arbitrariness? Like, of course they use Torah law. That's fantastic. Rather say, what was the problem? That they established their rulings on the basis of Torah law and did not go beyond the letter of the law, did not go really within the line of the law, within lifnim mishurat hadin, right? What was the problem? Now, of course, we know there's so many places where the rabbis talk about why Jerusalem was destroyed, which is a great example for, it means it was such a cataclysm in their society that it's the opportunity to rethink everything, right? Maybe it was destroyed because of this, maybe it was destroyed because of that, maybe it was destroyed because of that. They're basically pointing out all the flaws in their society. But one flaw they're pointing out is they're saying a society in which rules alone rule the day and people do not use their discretion to do more for each other, that is a society that is corrupt and should go down and will go down. That is a wild thing to say after this story with Rabbi Yishmael and this man. Because this story with Rabbi Yishmael and this man showed us that, what do you mean? Lifnim mishurat hadin, sometimes people just aren't worthy of it. Sometimes people will just take advantage of you. So after I thought about this for a while, I realized that this statement is not just saying you need to be able to give up some of your rights. It's that if you're in a society where giving up some of what you have is met with someone taking advantage of you, it's both sides. If you're in a society in which when you act like Rabbi Yishmael, other people act to you like the other man in the story, then we're in big trouble. The whole system is broken. And that to me is really significant. And it forces me to ask the question of, how do you train a society not just to say, we want certain people to be charitable, we want you to be charitable, but how do you train people to respond to that charity in a way that's not just taking advantage? And I would say three more things, and then I want to open it up. One, when you see examples like this, I think you ask yourself, where is it even possible to go lifnim mishurat hadin without getting taken advantage of? For example, in the political arena, is it possible? Or perhaps the stakes are just too high, perhaps the pressures are too much, people need to get reelected, so they're always going to take advantage of you every time, right? Maybe there are places where this just doesn't work, right? That's one. A second, if there are places where this actually should work, what do we actually have to do to build what's the groundwork so that this doesn't happen, or so that this is the aberration and not the norm, what happens with Rabbi Yishmael and the guy with the sticks? And what occurs to me right away is that it doesn't seem like these two know each other before this incident. It doesn't seem like they know each other at all. And there's something to be said for the relationships that are pre-existing and relationships that are worked on that can actually keep us from getting to this kind of point where someone's trying to help and someone just takes advantage, because people are more invested in that interaction than just that interaction, and then they'll go their separate ways. They actually are like, why am I having such trouble lately thinking about this thinker? Somebody will probably help me. The idea that we're all on a trampoline together, And when Maida steps on this part of the trampoline, Yael feels it on that part of the trampoline, right? Like that's what society is. It's not a zero sum. It's actually, we all impact each other. So if you have to build that awareness, and that awareness is not an abstract awareness. That awareness is when there's actually stuff at stake because you know them and they know you and you see each other and you're at synagogue together or your kids work together in whatever firm, whatever it is, right? There's something there. And then the third thing that I would say is I want to be the lawyer for the guy with the sticks for a minute. I want to be that person's counsel. Because as much as I actually think it was really inappropriate thing to do for him to ask Rabbi Yishmael to help him. If Rabbi Yishmael visibly looked older, that should have been obvious to him not to help. And yet at the same time, what if we read this guy with the sticks not as just an unfeeling person or a person who is a wise guy, but as a person who's actually trying to be exhibitionist to make a point, which is, Rabbi Yishmael, I asked you for help with the sticks, loading my car. I didn't ask you for money. And Rabbi Yishmael, with his, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, wanted to help, but didn't help the guy the way he needed help. He decided what he thought, how he could help, right? There's no conversation here between the two of them. What if that's also part of it? The question of what kind of communication, or by the way, even third party who knows both groups, is needed in order to make sure that my goodwill of where I'm trying to help somebody else is actually meeting them. It's meeting them where they need it instead of just what's going to make me feel good or what makes me feel like I'm doing the right thing. Those are my 3 points that I want to make. And I want to open it up to you. What do you think about this? What does this raise for you? You can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. No wrong answers, no wrong questions, right? Maybe he's exposing the loophole, right? Meaning maybe this man is saying, this is, what do you mean? Just because he's being the nice guy, I'm not getting what I need, right? It's totally possible. Any thoughts about this? I'm gonna cycle through to see if I have any hands raised or anything like that. Yes, okay, so I see Luis, Steve. Let's actually do this in an order. Okay, Luis,
Okay.
Steve, and let me just see if anybody else is raising their hands. I'm sorry, just to get it done. David M. And let's go in that order. Fantastic. Thanks, Luis.
I'd like to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to throw in the suggestion that when you raise the value of having pre-existing relationships that make discretionary action a more workable sort of thing with less risk that there'll be a ruthless taking advantage of it. This idea of knowing your community to me reads as an argument that there actually is some value to the legal side of things taking place at the local government level, where that's more possible for leaders to intimately know their communities. And as an argument against the protection from corruption in a larger scale government. So.
I think that's very wise, right? Meaning we know, essentially what you're saying is that this may actually be more possible on a local level because you need those relationships. We may not be able to expect this on a federal level, if you want to put it that way. But what you're doing is you're being realistic. You want to say something in response, Luis?
I would say that doing away with discretion and having the large scale regulation may not be the optimal solution. It may be that the better solution actually is local because it enables more interchange and communication and knowledge of the local community.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Meaning you would apply the communication rule, not just to discretion, but to law too, to law itself. Is that fair?
I'm making it as an argument against the superiority of regulation by law by the larger government entity rather than the smaller one.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Steve or Steven? I don't know where you went. You're in one of these.
Steve.
Oh, hi, Steve.
I think one thing that does come up in that sense that I think is critical in your discussion is that they have no connection with each other, that memory or acquaintance makes a difference. And what do we do when there is no memory in the community and things? But I want to ask you a question. You made a passing reference to friar. And it's become part of Israeli culture. Talk about the concept of the friar, which seems to be antithetical. In fact, a few weeks ago, Danielle in a discussion mentioned that one of the reasons that Israelis are aggressive about getting vaccinated is that no one wants to be a friar.
Yeah.
So talk about that, because the concept of the friar, experiencing it in Israel, is not one that I find admirable.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. Someone once taught me, and I truly believe this, that every trait has a good side and a bad side to it. And I actually think that the trait of not being a friar can actually, not wanting to be the sucker, can actually lead people to a great degree of resourcefulness, initiative, not resting on their laurels. I do think that there's something in there. And at the same time, I think it can lead you to jump the line, take advantage of other people in ways, and make decisions that are actually based much more on your ego than on what you think a healthy society should look like, right? So I think both are true. And I don't love that feature of Israeli society either, to be frank with you. I think it's very foreign to our American way of thinking, or at least the explicit way we talk about our American way of thinking, because there are plenty of people in American society who, right? Meaning, so part of this question is, when people are alleging falsely voter fraud, I'm going to think about how to do Lifnei Mishurat Hadin for somebody. Are you nuts? What, right? I'll explain sorry, Eric. A friar really just means a sucker. It's a sucker, somebody who gets taken advantage of, right? It's so, I'm gonna give you Heschel's.
By the way, is there anything that the rabbis say about friars?
Oh, there's so much that the rabbis say about friars. There are places where the rabbis say, actually, you're not gonna like it, or maybe you will like it, who say better to be a friar than someone who takes advantage of other people.
Wow.
Better to be the friar. They call it's min hane'elavim ve'enam olvim. Better to be the one who is insulted than the one who does the insulting. And it's you could argue that it's a little bit quietistic, meaning in the sense that that's not enough. It's kind of what the Zionists were upset about the diaspora Jew, that the diaspora Jew was willing to be the sucker, would rather that get kicked around in the dustbin of history than be the one doing the kicking. But there's something to that. I never want us to forget that voice, even as we're strong and we're not. I never want us to forget that voice, right? I want to give an image that I think captures like really the difficulty of this, which is when Heschel, I forget the name of the article, when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, he wrote this article that's really controversial in, I think, important ways about the Holocaust, where he essentially talks about how in European society, God was pushed out of public places. And because God was pushed out of public places, Cindy, I see your hand. Thank you for that. We'll get to you in a second. Because God was pushed out of public places, people did not have a conscience. They did not feel responsible to something bigger than themselves. And, the Holocaust is a result of that. It's very controversial because the Holocaust is a result of bad people making bad decisions and good people making bad decisions. And it's the Holocaust. He got a little bit slammed for the article, but it's real. I think it's worth thinking about. In it, he has this great image of people who are stuck in a pit of snakes. And most people are just batting against the snakes. And one person is just standing off to the side, seemingly not doing anything. And people look at that person and they say, what's going on here? Why are you not doing anything? And he says, what do you mean? I'm actually trying to figure out how to get us out of the pit, right? His whole vision was a different kind of vision. And you need people who are doing both of those. And I think what we're talking about here, whether it's using legal means and whether it's local or federal, whether it's using discretionary means and educational means, what we're talking about here is getting out of the pit. And that work is so adaptive and it's such a big reach. It is not, I don't think it's something we're going to see pay dividends for a long time, but it's work that has to be done. You need to be able to keep, at the same time, you need to be able to keep open that Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor, he was America's mayor. Remember that? 9/11, I was in New York. He's America's mayor. That he is using his legal he's using his status as a lawyer to promote massive fraud, to talk about trial by combat. You need to keep that open as, oh my goodness, that we need to do something about that. And now, and also keep open the very slow adaptive work of how do we prevent this from happening to the next Rudy Giuliani. And that is, it's a little crazy making, right? It feels like you're talking about something like, why does this matter? It matters because these things happen over 20 years. This happened over 20 years. How did it happen? Right? So there's a lot of work to be done. I think David was going to say, and then Cindy, and then I want to move to the second concept. David Mammon, I think.
Yeah. So I actually read that story as a true act of tzedakah by Rabbi Yossi. Here's obviously a very poor person who's carrying sticks to make a living. And obviously he asks a rabbi, an elderly person, for help. And I think Rabbi sees it as a way of helping him by giving him a dinar or half a dinar or whatever. And then we read the story again and we see, obviously he's such a poor guy. He does it again. And maybe he is a bit of a mamzer or, but a ganef. But I think the rabbi sees it as like, here's my opportunity to help this guy, but enough is enough. And that's kind of how I read the story, to try to, just to be helpful to him. And maybe that's on a much lower level, not the 30,000-foot level that you were talking, but it's the Jewish way. I see someone in the street, they need money, I'm going to stop by, I'm going to give them a shekel or two. And I think that's what, to me, that story represented.
I think that's very well said. I think what I would want to think about is how many times would this story have to happen until Rabbi Yishmael stopped trying, right? Meaning that's where we are as a society. It's happened so many times that it's, right? And remember, we have to be working on the legal side of things at the very same time as we're working on this educational side. But the story does tell you that you need not only to educate people to be charitable, you need to educate people not to take advantage of that. And that might be even harder. It might be even harder, right? Thank you. Cindy.
Thank you. So I think it comes too late because I think a few people said what I wanted to. I was glad to come after David and also after you and everybody else. Some of the things I just wrote down were that it's all about relationships, communication, vulnerability, conversation. And I think at the end of the day, everybody has ego, but where there's good intent, I really believe that it's incumbent upon us to go out on a limb for other people with the caveat that we may be taken advantage of. But if our intent was good and we were doing it without judgment, and I know we all have a little judgment, then in the end, we need to be prepared for what's ever going to happen. And And the example that came to my mind, you talked about the trampoline. I thought about also a greenhouse. We step on a trampoline, but God willing, we all end up in the greenhouse together growing, even if we grow in different directions, like flowers do in front of the window. And the other example I thought of was when my son was little, we lived in Boston and we used to take this same route up Newbury Street, and the same panhandler was there always asking for money. And I knew he was always drinking because there was cans around him. And I thought, how do we help him? And so what I told my son was that maybe we shouldn't give him money. Maybe we should ask him if there's something else we could do. And there was a 7-Eleven there. And we learned his name and we asked him if we could buy him food in 7-Eleven. And each and every time he said yes, he told us exactly what he wanted, including a cookie and a box of candy. And so there was a little judgment, right? Because I suspected there was some addiction or mental illness. But then we put the ball back in his court and said, here's our intent to do good. How can we do that for you? So I think it's all of the above.
Yeah, I think what you're saying also makes me think about what position do you have to be in order to be willing to do what you did?
You have to be very vulnerable.
And you have to be coming from an experience of, I'm willing to be vulnerable because I feel comfortable and confident and I have what I need. I'm coming from a mindset of abundance and not scarcity, right? Like if I'm thinking about how you do what you did. If you feel like you're beaten down by the world and everybody's taking advantage of you left and right? Meaning you have to feel like you're in a place where your ego is intact in a healthy way and you're not on the ropes so that you can do it. And I think about, for example, just to get back to the political for a second, if you are, if the Democrats are the majority and you're a Republican, or if the Republicans are the majority and you're a Democrat, and you feel like your way is beaten down over and over again, and you're, being taken advantage of left and right, are you able to do what you just articulated when you think there's need on the other side? And I think that's a huge question. I think I love to read this story with people and ask people who they think was more powerful in this story, who had more power in this story. And some people are like, oh, Rabbi Yishmael, of course, has more power in this story. He's a rabbi and he's, and then other people say, the man with the sticks had more power in this story. He knew that he shouldn't have been asking. So the question of where the power lies, I think is also really important, right? Meaning maybe you need sometimes the legal mechanisms, the enforcement mechanisms to get us back to a place where people feel like they're on somewhat of the same playing field in order for people to be comfortable and confident to go extra, right? Like we need to figure out how do we fight conspiracy theories before we can say like, oh, this conspiracy theorist, I would try to figure out how, right? So I think it's a really good, I think it's a very good example, right? It's a very good example. To what extent is humility a factor? I think humility is a big factor. I think the fact that Rabbi Yishmael was willing to continue to give this man money was more about his humility, and not because he's actually a sucker, but because he was making a decision to say, no, I'm going to be a good person here, even if you're not, right? There's something to that. Okay. Let's look at the second example, right? We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to give you the second example in the next 15 minutes or so. Second example is not a good guy example. It's not where you're being the good gal. It's not where you're giving the extra money. It's actually where someone's done something very bad. They've done something very bad. And this is specifically in a situation where there's actually nothing the court can do. There's nothing, law can't do anything about this. Now, anybody here who's a lawyer knows that there are situations in which, or a judge, there are situations in which the law's hands are tied. Now, do you want to do, do you want to do something to change the law, to change how things look in order to try to figure out how to fix what's going wrong with the law? Sure. But there are some things that the law actually will not be able, it can't solve everything, even if we wanted to. And so the rabbis have a category that is called being exempt in a human court, but being obligated in a divine court, right? Pater midine Adam and chayav b'dinei shamayim. That's their Hebrew translation of that. And this example, I warn you, I think it's going to upset you. And it upsets me. And the reason it upsets me is because it shows how there's always going to be places where the law and enforcement will not be able to go and will not be able to get us the outcome that we need. So let's take a look at it together. And I want to talk about the dilemmas that entails. This is a Mishnah in Bava Kama that I warn you, I think it's probably going to scandalize you, but just be ready to be scandalized, okay? It's the 3rd century of the Common Era. If something from that long ago doesn't scandalize you, I'm not really sure what we're doing here in terms of understanding history, right? So the rabbis say, this is all about damages. The topic here is not about endangering a minor. It's not about, being a nice person. It's what do you have to pay? What do you have to compensate if you cause damage to someone else? It's only about compensation. It's very narrow in its scope. And I tell you that because of what we're about to read. One who sends forth fire in the hands of a cheresh, a shoteh, or a minor, and we'll talk about cheresh and shoteh in a second, is not liable by human law, patur b'dinei adam, but is liable by the laws of heaven, chayav b'dinei shamayim. If one sent forth fire in the hands of a person of sound senses, the one of sound senses is liable. Meaning, and I'm going to interpret this the way that the Talmud interprets this and the way that later decisors interpret this. If Bernard gives a piece of coal that is still has embers to his grandson, and that grandson, instead of letting the coal go out, goes and lights a fire with it, like rekindles it, goes and lights a fire with it, we cannot charge Bernard for the damage. Okay, I told you you're going to be scandalized. Scandalized? Anybody scandalized? Yeah, I got it. It's scandalizing, right? The Talmud actually talks about the possibility that, or not the possibility, the way that the decisors deal with this later is they essentially say, okay, but if Bernard put a match that was lit in this person's hands, meaning where it was really like it was fire, then we are going to make him pay. Meaning they try to do whatever they can to minimize this exemption. They try to do whatever they can, okay? Because this is complicated. And they say that you're going to be required, obligated by the laws of heaven. Now, let me ask you a question. I understand obligated by the laws of heaven, that's real for a society that believes in God, for a society that believes in reward and punishment, for a society that believes that God is watching, right? That's real, right? But what is this idea? Like what does it mean for the law? What does it mean for a judge to say, we are not going to be able to collect money from you, but you should know that you are required by the laws of heaven to pay back, to pay for that, to pay for what you did. What is that if it has no legal teeth, right? We know this is why I started the conversation that law is very important and changing the law is very important, right? I know. But in those areas, what is this concept? Okay. And I want to say 2 things about this concept. The first thing I want to say about this concept is that I think what this concept is doing is it's suggesting that we need to have reasons for people to think about something as good or bad that is not just based on what's enforceable, right? Meaning, and we mentioned at the beginning, there are many reasons why a person would do something even if they don't have to, right? Some of those could be about they want to look good in front of somebody. It could be about reciprocity. It could be because they're a good person. It could be, but in a case of somebody who is willing to give a coal to a 6-year-old, right? Like a piece of flaming coal to a 6-year-old and not be kind of thinking about it. Well, you're not going to inculcate conscience in this person suddenly. It's It's not really going to happen. And so I've been thinking about this more and more, and I've been thinking about the concept of shame. That the idea that the judge would be able to say, I can't prosecute you here, but society should understand that there is deep shame in what you did, and what you did is wrong, even if I can't prosecute you. And again, go 10 years later, fix the loophole, change it, whatever, right? I can't prosecute you. There is something to the discourse of shame, not the discourse of humiliation, not the discourse of saying, oh, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. That the discourse of shame, like there is shame in the January 6th riots, shame. And we can try to deal with that shame by making fun of the guy who's wearing the horns or who's wearing, we deal with it through humor, and it's shameful, right? Where is the room for a discourse of shame, and not just a discourse of innocent until proven guilty, which is very, very important. But innocence is not just about law, right? And you could see how this could be quite dangerous. I want to mention that this concept of being chayav b'dinei shamayim, of being liable in the divine court, comes up in several situations in rabbinic law. They're all about paying damages, but they're very different from each other, right? I just gave you what I think is actually one of the most provocative, where somebody is responsible. Maybe that wasn't their intention, but they did something so incredibly negligent, right? And again, we're not talking about endangering a minor here, right? It's very narrow, right? But there are two other examples that I want to share with you in order to kind of expand what this is. One example is where somebody causes damage to themselves. The rabbis talk about how we can charge people if Judy or Alan cause damage to I don't know, David, right? Or Bernice. So they're going to have to pay. They would never, Bernice, they would never, right? If they cause damage, they would have to pay. What if somebody instead didn't cause damage to somebody else, caused damage to themselves? They embarrassed themselves in public purposely. They tore their hair out. Now, of course, we understand today the psychology of that probably means they're going through something psychologically very problematic for them, right? Like, but the rabbis, they didn't have that. They didn't have that way of thinking. They weren't I mean, it was, again, millennia ago, right? And what they talk about is that a person cannot be forced by a court to pay themselves restitution. I mean, what are you going to pay yourself? But they should know that in Dinei Shamayim, right? That in the laws of heaven, they are responsible not to do that to themselves. That idea of the laws of heaven, what are they trying to say? They're trying to say prosecution is not everything. Enforceability is not everything. There has to be some conscience, some awareness of something greater than just, am I going to get caught? Or I'll give another example, which for anybody here who is a doctor, you know this feeling, which is a doctor who is fabulous and does their work the way that they should and did all of their homework for a particular situation, and something went wrong and the patient got injured. Something went wrong. It's not a clear malpractice. Something went wrong. So the rabbis say, you can't be charged in a human court for the damages, but you should know that don't shirk your accountability. And I've never known a doctor who would say, oh, I got up the next morning and I felt just fine, right? Doctors do this. They carry this with them. It's reflecting how they're really trying to be good and they're trying to take accountability. But all of this is trying to push in the direction of wanting people to take accountability. And my question is, how do you teach that? How do you teach shame and not just humiliation for a community, for a world to be able to see and think? And how do you teach people not to run from their accountability, right? We're in this very litigious society. You say, I'm sorry, it's an admission of guilt, right? How do we actually teach people not to run from their accountability, but to recognize their accountability? I want to do one more thing with this, which is you might say, oh, this is insufficient. I'm sorry. It's insufficient. I know you have to teach people. You want to teach people. You want them to think. right? And as much as I'm going to push to say, actually, this is as important as the legal changes, but we also know it's as elusive, it's more elusive than trying to make the legal change, right? So I want you to see this last source. A few, in the 14th century, Rabbi Menachem Meiri, one second, loves of my life. Can you guys be quiet for a few more minutes? Thank you. You're wonderful. Okay. Rabbi Menachem Meiri, in the 14th century, living in France. I just want you to see, this is people trying to deal with how do we give this concept teeth? How do we give this reality, right? And he writes, Rabbi Menachem Meiri, in his commentary on Bava Kama, where a lot of this is talked about, this idea of being chayav b'dinei shamayim, being obligated in the laws of heaven. The greatest of the generation, Nachmanides, wrote that anyone who is liable by the laws of heaven is invalid for giving testimony in a Jewish court until they return the money. And this makes sense, he says, for given that they are required by the laws of heaven to return the money, the status of theft applies to them until they return the money. They're thieves. They're thieves. And if they're thieves, they can't testify in a Jewish court. What I love about this statement by the Meiri and citing Nachmanides is that he's saying, nah, it's really not enough. To say that something's shameful and to say that something's wrong and think that that's going to be enough when you walk out, it's not good enough. You actually have to figure out a way to say, I'm sorry, you're no longer allowed to be an actor in this play. You're no longer allowed to use this system because you abuse it so much. You can't use this system until you've made restitution, until you've compensated for what you've done wrong. And I think we're in trouble on this right now, right? Meaning we have people in American life, and by the way, in Jewish life,
won't admit what they've done wrong.
Who, as my son just said, won't admit what they've done wrong.
Can I be part of this conversation?
You are part of this conversation, doll. He said, can I be part of this conversation? I said, he is, right? Who won't admit what they've done wrong, who won't make restitution, who continually abuse the privilege of being a person of good standing within a system,
Like
and
rich people
actually saying that somebody is required in the laws of heaven. It has to have teeth. Something has to happen. Giuliani's got to get disbarred. Something's got to happen, right? And there's something to this kind of frustration, right, that I think we can all feel. And in some ways, it's where law and discretion are kind of crossing over, right? Where the Meiri says it's really not enough to just educate people towards this idea that there's dinei shamayim and da. We have to be able to act on that in some way as a community, right? So this, to me, what we've done here today, and I want to open for 5 minutes. What we've done here today is we haven't solved anything, okay? We haven't solved anything. We also have not been talking about the legal aspects. We could spend days on the legal aspects. This is not everything. This is one little piece of the puzzle, but I'm going to end how I started, which is I think this needs to be the conversation just as much as legal change or enforcement has to be part of the conversation, because that's both of those ways are the ways we get out of the pit. And we are in a very, very deep pit right now, as we know. And to my mind, instead of just getting depressed about it, and instead of just knowing how right each of us is about it, there is an educational need here. And some of this is about vocabulary and concepts and thinking and not being naive, but actually making a case for some of these things. And that takes a long time. It takes a long time. I want to open up for a few minutes before we close. I think we have 4 minutes left. Thoughts on this? I'm looking through. 16178, which I feel is very Jean Valjean. Yes.
Hello, my name is Jean.
Please.
Hi, that's my incognito. I have a broken laptop, so that's why my name isn't there. My name is Lloyd.
Hi,
What comes
Lloyd.
to mind for me when you're talking about this is the congressman in Washington who, in essence, is disobeying the law of the Congress by insisting he has the right to bring in a gun into the Capitol. So that is, he says, I guess it's the Second Amendment, he has the right. So it's two laws in conflict. And how does what you're suggesting, the educational or the morality of this, get involved, get him to think differently or act differently?
I think that's a really wonderful question. And I think part of the work that we have to do is actually, instead of everybody just calling each other out online, is to actually convene a way of figuring out what are the standards going to be, right? And that's why I think law is actually very helpful, right? You have to sometimes go back to what are the standards for this place that everybody has to follow and that are enforceable. And then beyond those standards, we can talk, we can argue, we can back and forth, but we need some basic standards, right? Sometimes it's not about the beyond the law. Sometimes it's just the law, right? So I really appreciate that, Lloyd. Wes, I'm going to invite you to close this up, and I'm just going to thank all of you for being willing to think about the pit that we're in, and hoping that these concepts actually just spur discussion with people, because those discussions can actually transform the way that we do business ourselves, and each one of us will have the impact that we can have in these regards. So please, Wes, if you would.
Yeah. So first of all, Elana, thank you. You're just so incredibly thoughtful and deep thinking and make us think. And I really appreciate it. And you have, over 100 screens on a cold morning engaged in this. So a very deep thank you. I want to say that whenever I hear one of your lectures, I always leave with at least a few huge unanswered questions. I wanted to just, so I don't have a bow and a wrapper and a nice little present to end with. I have a very big unresolved question to end with. And that is Jewish values, are Jewish values even relevant and helpful to the American snake pit that we're in now, or not? As everything that you're saying, let me put it this way. I wish we lived in a world, and I wish we lived in a country where Jewish values could actually be helpful. I wish we lived in a world, and I wish we lived in a country where all reasonable citizens could hear some version of your thoughts and we could work together on getting out of the snake pit. But I fear that Jewish values at a meta level are not relevant at all, because we're just so far away from each other that nothing will come of it. For example, you talked about shame, right? So I would suspect most people on this call think that what the people did who stormed the Capitol on January 6th is shameful. And so we would invite a conversation about shame as a check on how we act. That's the world that I wish we lived in, that our country could do that self-corrective. But in fact, millions of people cheer the insurrectionists. And they're the true patriots. They're the true patriots. You think that, I'll quote you. You think the revolution was a game of frickin' patty cakes? You think the revolution was a game of frickin' patty cakes? There was violence, there was guns, there was blood. That's how we were born, from violence, from revolution. We're trying to take back the country. Shame on you, Rabbi Hain. Shame on you and all your liberal effete people over here. Shame on you. The people who stormed the Capitol, they're the patriots. They're trying to save our country. And my question to you, Elana, is, since millions of people feel that way, millions of people had no shame in using the word overturn. They used the O word. They had no shame in using the word overturn. But they weren't even conscious enough or embarrassed enough or ashamed enough to use the word overturn. We want to overturn the election, that's a good thing to do. So my question is this relevant at all? And I always leave these Hartman conversations where Hartman and our messy democracy intersect, wondering, is this a useful project? I wish we lived in a country, but that's my unresolved question.
Okay, I'm going to say one last sentence and then we're out of here. if you were on my family WhatsApp chat, I think you might feel differently. The further apart the people are in the conversation, the harder it is to imagine this. But when it's not between people who cheer insurrectionists and people who don't, but it's between people who voted for the guy who pushed for the insurrection and people who would never, ever vote for that guy, within that group, I need to see these values in action. And you know what? The rest of it, maybe we can't bridge, but I know there's something bridgeable here. And I'm responding with a conviction that I don't always respond to. I know there's something bridgeable here because I have no choice but to bridge it. But yes, it's a big question. It's a big question.
Elana, but if somebody Zoom bombed here and said, and they were wearing red, white, and blue, and they had a flag which has now been co-opted as an item of terror, an American flag, and they said to you, I cheer what they did. They're taking the country back from Pelosi. And you, because you like Pelosi, you're shameful. And 45 is our patriot, and 45 is our hero. And I would give my life for 45. How are you going to have a discourse with that person? And there are millions of them.
I'm not sure I need a discourse with those people yet.
Well, there are millions of them.
I know there are millions of them, but I also know that there are people closer to home than that for me, where we have a hard time having a discourse. There's more to say. There's always more to say. You're right. And I'm not trying to have a discourse with the guy with the horns who eats organic food.
Elana.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I mean, again, this is the mark of a great class is not that it gives you answers. The mark of a great class is that it gives you ideals, and it gives you questions, and it gives you work to do to reach those ideals. So with deep gratitude for a wonderful class.
And to you, thank you.
I want to add my thanks to Elana, and I also want to direct people, as I always do, to the Hartman at Home Friday listserv that comes out. But this week especially, Elana has an article that came out Friday in the Times of Israel that speaks to Wes's concern, and it's talking about the importance of truth and relationships. And I think, Wes, when you get to that article, it will give you somewhat of an answer to what your concern is that you laid out right here at the very end. So
even if you disagree.
Even if you disagree. So again, thank you so very much, Elana, for being here with us again. And thank all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next month for Donnie Siegel on Sunday, March 14th. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Have a great day, guys.
Stay healthy.
You too.